Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. Coming up tonight, Labour's investment summit, some toing and froing over P&O ferries, and SpaceX's successful rocket booster mission. Lots of people saying this is very significant. Of course, though, first we will be discussing the latest from Gaza and some really horrific footage, which I imagine many of you will have already seen on social media today. The world once again woke up today to shocking footage exposing the abject brutality of Israel's assault on Gaza. The gruesome scenes are from the Al-Aqsa hospital in central Gaza, which was hit by an Israeli airstrike in the early hours of Monday morning. The airstrike hit tents housing displaced civilians in the courtyard of the hospital. Really distressing footage has been shared online showing a person who seems to be burning alive, really, really horrific, unable to escape the flames. 4 people died in the bombing, 70 were injured, many severely. The head of the emergency department at the hospital has said that many of the victims are children and women with third-degree burns. Al Jazeera reported from the aftermath of the attack.
What you see on my right side, this is the bomb site. This is where all the tents were set up by the displaced people. Many of these people ended up in Al-Aqsa hospital after being displaced many times, thinking that this will be their safe place inside the hospital, but not anymore. Just seeing the devastation caused by the ongoing attacks on Al-Aqsa hospital.
We woke up around 2 a.m. to horrific explosions. Fire was everywhere. Everything was on fire. We are displaced and we live in tents. The fire burned a lot of people. We quickly left the tents with our clothes, and we lost everything in our tents. We lost the little money that we had. You can see the destruction. This is beyond logic, and our minds cannot understand this. We lost everything. We're now living in the open. We were displaced more than once, and now we're in the situation that you see right now. There is no safety nor security anywhere in Gaza.
Al Jazeera later spoke to a surgeon at the Al-Aqsa hospital.
Burns patients require a lot of post-operative interventions. So they need ICU level care. They need close monitoring. There is no capacity in ICU as it stands. We're already dealing with the overflow from mass casualty incidents and the general baseline level of trauma that we get. And then to add to that, you have patients with a significant high percentage burns. Unfortunately, their fate is sealed. They won't even make it to the ICU. They will die. And that's been the case. Many children, many women with significant burns die. And that's the reality on the ground here. We don't have ICU capacity. We don't have appropriate dressings for burns patients. It's a horror show here. It doesn't feel real anymore. Honestly, sometimes I feel like this is not real life, that this can go on and this degree of suffering is allowed to happen in this world. It's unimaginable.
That surgeon wasn't just treating patients from the bombing of the Al-Aqsa hospital on Sunday. Israel also bombed a nearby school housing displaced civilians. At least 22 people were killed there. UNRWA said the bombed school had been due to be used today as a polio vaccination site. This is UNRWA, the UN, said today it was going to be a polio vaccination site. Yesterday, Israel bombed it. Both of these two atrocities, so the school and the hospital, they were in central Gaza. What Israel is doing in northern Gaza, though, has humanitarian groups even more concerned. There have been reports this afternoon of Israeli warplanes targeting another school, sheltering displaced people in the Jabalia refugee camp. But it's the evacuation orders which are affecting the largest number of people. Flyers distributed on Sunday by the IDF ordered up to 400,000 people to evacuate northern Gaza and to move south. The area under evacuation includes Jabalia, Beit Lahaya, and Beit Hanun. Many of the people being told to evacuate have, of course, already been displaced multiple times and know that moving south is no guarantee of safety. And journalists on the ground have reported some say they would prefer to die than move again. Meanwhile, the UN World Food Programme says no food aid has entered northern Gaza since the start of this month. They've said, quote, the north is basically cut off and we're not able to operate there. The country director of the World Food Programme spoke to the BBC.
In Jabalia, exactly, we used to have a bakery. We were forced to shut it down. We actually had 2 bakeries up and running in the northern of Gaza. We had to close them due to the current impact of the crisis. So currently, the biggest fear that we have as the World Food Programme was actually to ensure that with the end of the crossings, we have no food that did enter into Gaza since the 1st of October in the northern of Wadi Gaza.
And we're hearing that it's a challenge for some of the people there in northern Gaza to follow those Israeli orders and to leave that part of the territory to move further south. So when they remain there, what options do they have? What kind of humanitarian support do they have?
Currently, most of people that are actually have been moving within the north of Gaza, they actually went to schools and shelters. The way we've worked as the World Food Programme and with our partners on the ground was actually to ensure at the beginning of the new phase in the north of Gaza to actually dispatch all our assistance to our partners on the ground. This is how we manage if we don't have access to our warehouses, if we don't have access anymore to some of the bakeries, it's actually to make sure that the partners are still up and running.
So what does Israel hope to achieve with this renewed siege of northern Gaza? Well, according to the Associated Press, Netanyahu has been considering a plan to empty northern Gaza of all civilians and cut off aid to those left inside. They report this. The plan proposed to Netanyahu and the Israeli parliament by a group of retired generals would escalate the pressure, giving Palestinians a week to leave the northern third of the Gaza Strip, including Gaza City, before declaring it a closed military zone. Those who remain would be considered combatants, meaning military regulations would allow troops to kill them, and denied food, water, medicine, and fuel, according to a copy of the plan given to the Associated Press by its chief architect, who says the plan is the only way to break Hamas in the north and pressure it to release the remaining hostages. The plan calls for Israel to maintain control over the north for an indefinite period to attempt to create a new administration without Hamas splitting the Gaza Strip in two. Evacuating a whole third of Gaza and then declaring anyone there combatants would obviously be immoral. It would also be completely illegal. And I think would be very clearly ethnic cleansing. When asked if Israel's new evacuation orders should be considered to be part of this plan, an Israeli military spokesperson said no, but another official told Associated Press that the plan was already being implemented. I'm joined now by the humanitarian communications lead at Action Aid, Frankie Leach. Frankie, I know you work with lots of partners who are in northern Gaza, working there at the moment, in hospitals there especially. What are they telling you?
Our partners in Gaza are describing something that is beyond catastrophe. They've been working now on the emergency response since October 7th, mainly in northern Gaza. Our partner, the Al-Wada Hospital, is one of the only functioning maternity health centres in across all of Gaza that's providing support for babies in incubators, for example, and pregnant women. And they've been providing services throughout the whole period of October 7th up until now, which obviously, as you can understand, has been increasingly difficult as the Israeli forces continuously encroach on that area, and particularly in areas like Deir al-Balah. We've seen massive escalations in the last few days, and our partner, the Al-Wada Hospital, in the last week or so received evacuation orders from the Israeli forces telling them that if they did not leave the hospital, they could be, facing imminent attack as Israeli forces move into northern Gaza to, quote, expel Hamas. And what we've seen is that, our partners are displaying incredible bravery by refusing to evacuate with their patients. Many of those patients are on kidney dialysis, for example, for their bloods, or are cancer patients or pregnant women who are about to give birth or who have just given birth, babies in incubators. So these are patients that can't be evacuated. And what's been very clear to us as an NGO now for the last year is that evacuations mean nothing in the context of Gaza, because there is nowhere to evacuate to, which constitutes as a war crime. And it's clear that when people do evacuate to humanitarian safe zones, as they are so called, those are, coming under increased attack by the Israeli forces. So there's nowhere safe in Gaza for our kind of medical teams to be able to operate through with our partners. We heard reports last week that medics who did decide to evacuate from different hospitals were shot at as they were trying to carry patients to safe zones. So it's very clear to us that our partners are operating with extreme bravery, trying to provide, medical support to whoever needs it, of course, which is everyone in Gaza right now, but it's becoming increasingly impossible to do so as they face, direct bombardment and fire from the Israeli forces.
I mean, the stories coming out of Gaza at the moment, it does feel a lot like it did a year ago. So what we're seeing is, hospitals being attacked, evacuation orders being made across sort of vast swathes of the strip. And I suppose I wanted to ask you to sort of compare the two. How does what we're seeing now, compare to what we saw in October and November of last year?
I think the only difference in terms of what we're seeing now is that it's not new. I think at the time, around early October, we were very shocked to see the level of destruction and disregard for civilian life by the Israeli forces as they entered their ground operation in Gaza. The difference now is that the international community is well aware of the level of apparent war crimes and abuses of human rights that seem to be conducted by the Israeli forces on a daily basis against civilians in Gaza. The only difference now is that the international community can't say it wasn't aware or that they haven't had time to act upon it. We've been advocating for a long time for the government to put a ban on arms sales, which we believe would have a direct impact in terms of weaponry not being used against civilians in Gaza, as many organisations such as Oxfam and Human Rights Watch have reported over the last year that artillery that has been sent by other states to Israel has been used in attacks directly on civilians in Gaza. As NGOs, we're kind of wringing our hands at this point because, as you say, the anniversary is hard to ignore. I only mentioned to a colleague today that it feels like we're back to Groundhog Day, as it were, which is that every single day we seem to report a new massacre from our partners. We will try and write strongly worded letters and emails to Foreign Office officials. We've advocated through campaigning techniques to call for a ceasefire, and nothing seems to work. And it seems to me that people are desensitized now to what is happening in Gaza. Many of your listeners and watchers will have seen some horrendous footage over the weekend of patients burning as they're attached to IV drips from a hospital that was bombed in Deir al-Balah over the weekend. And what we've seen is that the Israeli forces have said they will investigate, and clearly investigation needs to be impartial. No UN investigators have been allowed into Gaza to do that investigation, certainly not international journalists. And as a media team in an NGO, we rely working heavily with local journalists in Gaza to report on what is happening to them, but it's clear that it's falling on deaf ears, and the issue around justice and accountability as humanitarians working in the space, we're reaching a dead end at this point because it seems that there isn't a message that we can convey that is loud enough or strong enough to be able to get the international community to stop what is happening in Gaza. And our partners are left there like sitting ducks, either to be bombed or evacuated to God knows where. And, they are losing hope, which is a very upsetting space to be in when you're working with your partners, trying to support them through what is clearly a genocide, and there is nothing that we can do to help them.
There was a really shocking report in the New York Times last week with lots of healthcare professionals saying they had witnessed young children with bullet wounds to the head and chest and neck. And they said this could only really have been done by sort of targeting by snipers. Is that a phenomenon that you're aware of sort of directly in your work, sort of that children seem to be actively being targeted by the IDF?
I mean, I can't comment specifically on whether the IOF chooses to directly target children. We can only look at the facts that come through our partners. And what we can tell you is that the level of victims in children, say, under the age of 12, is astronomically high. Now, Gaza was quite a young population to begin with, so the level of children at risk during these attacks are already much higher than in most conflicts. What I can tell you is that we've worked alongside partners in the West Bank for a long time now, and there is significant evidence to show that children who are either throwing rocks or playing in the street or have altercations with Israeli forces will be intentionally targeted. And those reports have come out of Human Rights Watch. The BBC actually put a documentary about this recently. So all we can kind of clarify and corroborate are the facts, which is that children are being, attacked and killed and maimed and disabled on a scale that we've not seen before. And if that's not intentional, then it's certainly something that needs to be accountable to the Israeli forces, who are obviously on the other end of those guns and those bombs.
And can I get you to comment on the reports that Netanyahu has been presented with a plan to essentially empty northern Gaza, declare anyone who remains there a combatant, and then sort of, well, I mean, it's already the case, isn't it, that food is being blocked from entering since the beginning of October?
Of course, I mean, it would constitute as a war crime if Netanyahu's plan for northern Gaza was to be enacted. And clearly what we've said is that withholding food throughout this crisis does constitute as a war crime, and we would urge the International Criminal Court to look into those comments intensely. And I think also what we also are very concerned about with northern Gaza is that if you evacuate people in northern Gaza, where will they go to in Gaza? Rafah has been completely bombed and destroyed. There is no longer a humanitarian zone in Rafah. The humanitarian zone now in Gaza is a few streets, and there are still millions of people living in Gaza. So we're extremely concerned to see where those people will go, what will happen to them. And certainly for our partners, they're still trying to operate as humanitarians. And the reason they have stayed in northern Gaza is because there is significant humanitarian need for the population that lives there. Those people aren't Hamas, and it's very clear that collective punishment, which is the kind of thing that Netanyahu is describing in his plan for northern Gaza, is illegal. It does constitute as a war crime, and war crimes should be persecuted.
Frankie Leach, thank you for joining me this evening. Let's turn to Israel's war with Lebanon, where Israel have continued to attack UN peacekeepers. The UN interim force in Lebanon released this statement yesterday, and they say early this morning, peacekeepers at a UN position in Ramya observed 3 platoons of IDF soldiers crossing the blue line into Lebanon. At around 4:30 a.m., while peacekeepers were in shelters, 2 IDF Merkava tanks destroyed the position's main gate and forcibly entered the position. They requested multiple times that the base turn out its lights. The tanks left about 45 minutes later, after UNIFIL protested through our liaison mechanism, saying that IDF presence was putting peacekeepers in danger. At around 6:40 a.m., peacekeepers at the same position reported the firing of several rounds 100 meters north, which emitted smoke. Despite putting on protective masks, 15 peacekeepers suffered effects including skin irritation and gastrointestinal reactions after the smoke entered the camp. The peacekeepers are receiving treatments. That sounds like chemical weapons used against UN peacekeepers, right? It's like, how far is Israel willing to go to, I suppose, put up 2 fingers, not just to the Palestinians, but the entire international community, the real international community, right? The one that's represented in the UN, not the international community we hear of, which is basically just Europe, right? And some of their friends. On Sunday, Hezbollah killed 4 Israeli soldiers and injured dozens more when a drone made it through Israeli defenses to attack an army base. The manner in which the attack has been reported has attracted criticism. Sky News initially tweeted this. Israel has named the 4 teenage victims of a Hezbollah drone strike on a military base, as at least 23 people were reportedly killed in an attack on a central Gaza school. So it's the teenage victims. It doesn't say that they're military victims, and then it's just 23 people were reportedly killed in an attack on a central Gaza school. So you can see how that seems a bit dehumanizing when it comes to the Palestinians. That tweet was ultimately deleted, but on screen, Kay Burley went on to say this.
The 4 soldiers that have died have now been named. All of them were just 19 years old. They are Sergeant Omri Tamari. In addition to that, Sergeant Yosef Hieb, Sergeant Yoav Agmon, and Sergeant Alon Amite. As I said, all 4 of them just 19 years old.
So Ash, I want your thoughts on this. Lots of people have reacted to that clip from Kay Burley and those tweets by Sky. And it's not just Sky, obviously. It's, nearly all of the Western media has sort of done this. It's sort of taken the time to name individual Israeli soldiers, show pictures of them, describe them as teenagers, really, really humanize them. And people are contrasting that to how we hear about Palestinians, which is 23 people reportedly killed, right? We don't hear the names of those children, right? Of those women and men who, by the way, in most cases are actually civilians, right? We say all the time you should make a distinction in war between killing civilians and killing military, but it seems like actually the Western media is valuing the lives of Israeli military higher than it is Palestinian civilians.
Well, I think you pointed out something really important, which is when 4 Israeli soldiers are killed at a military base, we see their photos, we see them looking happy and carefree, we learn their names, they are presented to us as human, and I think in some fundamental way as being like us, and that's reflected by the emotion that you can hear in Kay Burley's voice. There's clearly a level of identification going on, this feeling of, well, they could be my sons. And I understand that. I think it's deeply sad when anyone dies. And the blame that I place on that really is the state, which has a policy of conscripting its own youth to uphold an occupation and wage multiple wars of aggression on multiple different fronts simultaneously. What I'm interested in highlighting isn't just the racism, and I think it is racism involved, in these four soldiers being presented to us as fully fleshed human beings, whereas Palestinians and Lebanese are just numbers. I also want to highlight the double standard present in the arguments presented by Israel's advocates internationally. So, when a densely populated civilian area, whether that's Beirut or the open air prison of Gaza, is being bombarded by IDF forces, when water, fuel, food, medicine is being cut off to the entire population of Gaza as it was at the beginning of this genocide a year ago. Well, it's very sad, it's tragic, but ultimately, what Israel's advocates say is that this is unfortunate collateral in the prosecution of legal military objectives, i.e., the targeting of Hamas. But then, when it's four soldiers who have been killed at a military base, no less, we're not talking about four soldiers being killed when they happen to be in a residential area of Tel Aviv or something like that, then the language that's used is murder, they're teenage victims, and their military role is wholly obscured. Now, any straight thinking person would say you can't have it both ways. You can't have it that when Palestinian children, Palestinian women, Palestinian civilians are being killed by their thousands, well, that's just unfortunate collateral. But when it's soldiers being killed at a military base, well, that's murder, right? That is not only inconsistent, that's an inversion of what the normative rules of war are. And I think that any media organization worth its salt, I'm not even talking about a media organization which is committed to the Palestinian cause, just one which is committed to basic facts, should at least point that out, right? Or if not point that out, say, okay, we're going to present these individuals as soldiers. We're going to talk about it in terms of military objectives because they're soldiers and it's a military base. It is different. It is qualitatively different. It is legally different from bombing a densely populated civilian area. These are two different things. Morally, it's perfectly fine if someone says, well, I think that any loss of human life is completely objectionable. That's fine by me. That's a completely consistent moral position. But what isn't is to use words like murder and teenage victims when you're talking about soldiers, and to frame either explicitly or implicitly the death of thousands of Palestinians and thousands of Lebanese people as unfortunate collateral as you pursue a lawful military objective.
What they'll presumably say is, it's we're not making a judgment here, we're not making a value judgment, but it just so happens that the Israeli authorities send us these pictures and these names, and do they say that the Palestinian, I suppose they don't respect any of the Palestinian authorities enough to take seriously if they were to send them the photos and the names. I mean, do you see what I mean? Do you think it's based on sort of an overt bias or sort of laziness, which is just, it's easier to get this information from the Israelis because they will, they have a very effective sort of PR team and PR system, essentially?
My response to that question, Michael, is a sort of yes and a no. So yes, it is a lot more difficult, especially considering the destruction of, the governmental infrastructure in Gaza. It is very, very difficult for, the individuals to be identified, for that to be corroborated, and for that information to be released internationally in a way that, I understand journalists might feel that they're able to rely on. That's why there's a lot of contestation of the official figure of the number of those killed since October 7th in Gaza, because since October 7th, what you've had is a destruction of much of the healthcare infrastructure and also destruction of the sort of record-keeping infrastructure in Gaza, meaning that it's likely that the number that we have, which is about 40,000, is an undercount of the people who have actually died, because the mechanism we have to keep track has been destroyed. But you also have a problem, which is that Palestinian sources are considered to be a lot less reliable. So now it is pretty standard in UK media for when you have figures being released by the Health Ministry of Gaza, it's framed as the Hamas-run health ministry. Now, this turn of phrase has proved so effective at, I suppose, discrediting the Palestinian cause that it's since been applied to Lebanon. So people have talked about the Hezbollah-run health ministry, even though, yes, there are Hezbollah-run health services, but there is no Hezbollah-run health ministry. In fact, the Minister of Health has got no affiliation to Hezbollah whatsoever. But that's still been repeated verbatim as though it is a fact when it's far from a fact by international media sources. So Palestinian sources are framed as inherently unreliable. When you have Palestinian self-shot footage, so Palestinians recording what they're seeing on their phones, reporting what's happened to their families, that's not considered a reliable source. Now, I understand it's important for journalists to not take any source at face value, right? I understand that, and I think that even in times like this, that's important. But what you have is this sort of shortcut for the Israeli government, for the IDF, to pump information into the international media. And you've got all of these obstacles for Palestinian sources of information. And that shortcut for Israel, by the way, has meant that things which are outright lies, whether it's the reports of beheaded babies or babies in ovens on October the 7th, outright lies just enter the English-speaking media completely unfiltered, and then everyone has to do a reverse ferret when it turns out, at best they do a reverse ferret, at worst they just pretend it never happened, and those lies stay in circulation. I think there's an argument for treating a lot of information. I'm not talking about this particular piece of information about the soldiers. I'm talking more generally, that there should be more obstacles for Israeli sources of information to make it into English media than there are at present.
I also think that, any time they say we've been unable to verify this, or this is reported from the, I don't think they should say Hamas. I think they should just say the health ministry or whatever. They should say that, by the way, the reason it is difficult for us to verify this is because Israel has banned any journalists from entering Gaza for the past 12 months, right? If the excuse of the Western media is to say it's harder to verify and collect the evidence directly from Gaza than it is when the event has happened in Israel, then explain why, right? It's not because of some sort of natural difference between those two places. It's because Israel is banning journalists from entering. So I see why sort of journalists want stuff verified before they repeat it. But if they're unable to verify things on the Palestinian side, explain why. Because Israel won't let any journalists in, right? If they did that every time they said that, if they said 42,000 people have been killed, that's according to the Palestinian Ministry of Health. Journalists haven't been able to verify this because no one has been allowed to enter Gaza. No Western journalist has been allowed to enter Gaza for the past year. And actually, many humanitarian organizations think it could be much higher. That would, if you want to give a clarification, if you want to give a qualification to be really careful, then say all of those things as well. Before we move on to our next story, a quick notice about an event coming up from Novara Media that you can get tickets to. Ash will be hosting a IRL Downstream at Peckham Levels in South London on November the 5th. She'll be speaking to the best-selling author of How to Blow Up a Pipeline, Andreas Malm, about his new book, Overshoot. The link for tickets is in the YouTube description box below. Ash, though, what's the elevator pitch? In a minute, can you tell me more about the event and why people should go?
Yeah, absolutely. So number one, you should go to this event because I'm going to be there and I'll be lonely if you don't. The perhaps more intellectual justification for why you should get tickets for this is that Andreas Malm is one of the foremost thinkers of climate politics and movement-based climate politics, I think, in the West. His book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, has been turned into a film. And this new book, Overshoot, I think is really, really critical reading for anyone who takes the climate crisis seriously. Because one of the things that's really difficult for us to imagine, and I include myself in this, is that the effects that we're seeing of climate change now, so more frequent and more severe weather events, including something like Hurricane Milton, which happened just a couple of weeks or just last week, that is the result of, decades and perhaps even centuries old carbon it being put into the atmosphere, right? So all of the stuff we're seeing now, right, the sort of instability of supply chain, global heating, severe weather events, a lot of that can be attributed to, the Industrial Revolution. We have since then, right, and especially since the time of knowing that man-made climate change is real, we have continued to put carbon into the atmosphere. Now, the effects of that are going to be felt way further down the line, even if we were to take carbon emissions to net zero tomorrow. And so, this idea of overshoot, and actually, have we already, have we already passed, several climate tipping points? I think it's really important for anyone interested in politics to engage with, because it's no good all of us sitting here pretending that the policy we're advocating for is going to be made in conditions which are, relatively similar to the ones we have today. They are not going to be similar to the ones we have today. And I think that Andreas Malm is easily one of the most interesting and provocative voices on what those conditions might be like, the fights which are necessary for us to have in the present, and what the conditions are going to be like in the future. I hope that made sense. That was my elevator take. It would have to be a very, very long elevator, I think.
It made a lot of sense. The event, again, is November the 5th, and the ticket link is in the description box below. Labour today hosted its first International Investment Summit, where it schmoozed global business leaders. Keir Starmer repeated in the speech that his priority was growth and made this appeal to the executives in attendance.
Every one of you here today has been invited for that reason. It's not just that you lead some of the most important businesses in the world. It's also because you're pivotal to this great cause of our times. And the reason we are focusing so much on investment is because the mission of growth in this country in particular demands it. Private sector investment is the way we rebuild our country and pay our way in the world.
So Starmer there is pretty much begging for private sector investment, of course, because they don't want to break their fiscal rules, and to encourage those businesses to invest. Starmer also promised deregulation.
Britain's global standing. We're determined to improve it, determined to repair Britain's brand as an open, outward-looking, confident, trading nation. But we've also got to look at regulation across the piece. And where it is needlessly holding back the investment we need to take our country forward. Where it's stopping us building the homes, the data centres, the warehouses, grid connectors, roads, train lines, you name it. Then mark my words, we will get rid of it. So it's time to upgrade the regulatory regime. Make it fit for the modern age. Harness every opportunity available to Britain. We will rip up the bureaucracy that blocks investment. We will march through the institutions and make sure that every regulator in this country, especially our economic and competition regulators, take growth as seriously as this room does.
The march through the institutions, is that Gramsci or Mao? I can't remember which one it is. Anyway, talking about what do I think about this? There's obviously a terrible form of deregulation, which I would not be too confident Labour won't go down, where you sort of essentially lower health and safety standards. Lots of people sort of, when Keir Starmer talking about getting rid of red tape, rightly talking about Grenfell, that was able to happen because governments for a very long period of time had said, we don't want to put too many restrictions on building companies because that will stop them building. That will make it too expensive. So if you try and encourage people to build buildings by lowering standards, terrible idea. If by sort of changing regulations, he means disallowing NIMBYism in more circumstances or being able to override it, then as we've talked about on this show many times before, I'm fairly in favour of it. The investment summit culminates this evening with an exclusive dinner reception in St Paul's Cathedral with King Charles. And this does make me a little bit jealous. Entertainment from Elton John. I saw him at Glastonbury last year, and we were told it was his last ever UK concert. So I feel a little bit cheated now that he is doing another UK concert and it's just for business executives. But there you are. I'll get over it. Starmer and Reeves, of course, are hoping this will all inspire confidence in the UK economy after a rocky start in which Labour overdid a message of doom and gloom. And they've already won plaudits from Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google.
I was shocked when Labour became strongly in favour of growth.
Wealth creation is the number one mission of a Labour government.
Did you hear that?
Yeah. It's true.
And I actually know you well enough to know you actually believe this. So when I look at this, I say to myself, how will you pull it off? In the time I've spent with this group in the last few days, there's plenty of money that's going to come into the country if you achieve what you just said. So when I listen to this, I think maybe instead of calling it regulation and investment, you should call it a lot of investment and very small amount of regulation. Or maybe you need a minister of anti-regulation. A more serious proposal is that democracies, especially something as long as old as this one, have so many ways in which people can say no. I'd much rather, and I think the business community would much rather have a single person who can say yes or no, and who says no, and then they can move on. The cost of capital and the delay is killing you. Yeah. And furthermore, you're not going to achieve your 2030 energy goal, which is laudable, without fixing this. Yeah. So you have a tactical leadership problem to achieve this, and I think you can pull it off. But you have to figure out a way to get control. You have strong political capital right now. You just started. You're forming your government. You've got to find a way to get them to move on this agenda.
So he's saying, we want one guy in charge of everything who can say yes or no. Now, many people might suggest that's a little bit undemocratic. You just want the one guy. As I say, I think there are arguments that the planning process takes a little bit too long, but saying we want to cut all the democracy crap out, which seemed to be there what Eric Schmidt was kind of suggesting, I think will understandably ring some alarm bells. Obviously, of course, the sight of sort of a captain of industry telling a prime minister, you know what we need? Deregulation. There is a history of that before the financial crisis. That's what all the bankers were saying. It didn't go very well, of course. Eric Schmidt also had a message about data centers.
The demand for energy for data centers is massive. We need you to approve the necessary steps to make these data centers in Britain, because your research scientists, your companies, your citizens all need these things. Now, how can I be in favor of green energy and also in favor of using more electric power? Because the more electric power allows us to build new materials, new science, eventually get fusion, which is the ultimate solution to these problems, and so forth. Just an improvement in energy efficiency through new materials in cars and distribution networks and so forth has a huge impact. DeepMind here did a test on data centers where with a small algorithmic change using their algorithm, which is called reinforcement learning, they improved performance by 15%. If you had a 15% improvement in energy efficiency in the distribution in Britain, think of the amount of additional capital that would free up for further investment. So it's paradoxical. Invest in AI, and as a result, the solutions to the energy transition become apparent much quicker.
That plenary between Starmer and Schmidt was clearly very well choreographed, but the lead up to the business summit hasn't been smooth sailing, and that is a pun intended, because one of the guests, DP World, the Dubai-based owner of P&O Ferries, you see the pun, initially put its £1 billion UK investment on hold after Transport Secretary Louise Haigh said this.
They're a rogue operator. We're cracking down on the way that they've treated employees, and we want to see them mirror the standards of other operators that come in and out of Great Britain's waters.
Would you travel with P&O Ferries?
No, I've been boycotting P&O Ferries for 2.5 years, and I'd encourage consumers to do the same.
You might remember P&O Ferries for suddenly firing all 800 of its British staff in 2022 and replacing them with agency workers who worked longer hours for lower pay. And fire and rehire is one of the practices Labour promised to outlaw in its new Bill of Workers' Rights. That's why Louise Haigh there was saying that they're a rogue operator and that she's boycotting them. But when that threat came in that they would pull their investment in the country, Downing Street wasn't willing to risk that $1 billion. And they sided with P&O over their Transport Secretary. They distanced themselves from Haigh's comments over the weekend. And on Radio 4, Secretary for Science and Innovation Peter Kyle was asked about that U-turn.
Are you that keen to impress big investors that you disown your own words these days?
Well, the first thing that everybody should celebrate is that if you have a new innovation in this country and you get it through regulation and out into the economy, creating jobs and wealth, that is something everybody should celebrate up and down the country, and particularly the workers who will get great jobs as a result.
Sure, but
Secondly,
what about the
P&O,
fact that you disowned your own Transport Secretary?
Secondly, on that particular issue, you and everyone else criticised what P&O did back then. But last week we introduced workers' rights legislation. P&O and its parent company signed up to it. P&O has been on a journey, just as our country has been on a journey. We have a change election, a change government with higher expectations of employers. And it is fantastic that we have companies who are going on that journey. And then right here today, we have
So someone in Downing Street had forgotten that we got a new government, have they?
Coming. We have £40 trillion worth of global assets represented by companies who are here in London, seeing how we as a country can attract their investment, spread it across all parts of the United Kingdom to benefit workers right across the country. This is exciting times.
Sure.
We had 12 businesses today.
That wasn't the question. It's an interesting answer, but it wasn't the question, was it?
To endorse the government and our approach. And these are the things people are focused on. And right here with us is DP World, the parent company of P&O. They are focused on the future. This government is focused on the future, and that's what you're seeing today, the future being realised and capitalising on all the potential that we see the country has if only you get the fundamentals right, if only you take the tough decisions, and you show to businesses that we are open for business as a country once again.
The P&O ferries are changed. They're on a journey, in fact, and Labour are going on a journey with them. Ash, is this all a little bit embarrassing?
I love that phrasing so much. I can't tell you. It's just like, well, P&O have gone on a journey, right? As if what happened is that P&O were actually in quite a bad place. And so, yeah, they did some terrible things like fire and rehire, but that's because ultimately they hadn't learned to love or accept themselves. And so then by beginning microdosing with psilocybin, just a little bit every day, it really opened them up to the universe, and it made them more accepting of themselves and therefore more accepting of workers' rights as well. Like, it's just such like fatuous, like hippy dippy, this company is my friend, like nonsense. And it's just such a clearly absurd way of talking that there's something in me which enjoys seeing a leading politician.
Isn't that good industrial policy? We're calling in big business instead of calling it out.
I think that it's really important for us to, rather than advocating things like unionizing or strengthening collective bargaining rights or introducing, I guess, strengthening the stick that Labour has against the sort of, Goliath of capital. Sorry, that's a mixed metaphor. Rather than doing all of those things, which like kind of seem a bit bad vibes, like instead, maybe we have some kind of healing circle, right? Maybe give P&O
with Elton
Ferry
John.
some ayahuasca.
I mean, that's pretty cool. Microdosing with Elton John, St. Paul's Cathedral. Is that where? Or maybe I've just taken that off the top of my head. But anyway, I'm sure they're going to have a wonderful evening. Maybe they're doing all of this.
You're going to have to really get over this Elton John thing. Like, I know that you felt, a bit disappointed that you thought it was like the last ever gig, and then these like fucking like corporations.
To be honest, it was way too long.
Have to move on.
I really enjoyed about five of the songs, and it was 2 hours long.
I think just to talk about the politics of it for like 1 second.
Sorry, we were talking. I thought we were talking about Elton John and Iowa. No, sorry, talking about the politics. Let's go for it. I'm being annoying. Talk about the politics, please.
Just talk about the politics for 1 second, Michael. It's a politics show. Jesus Christ. Just talk about the politics of this for 1 second. I think that there's always been this tension with Keir Starmer's project, which on the one hand, he sort of said, in order to have growth, we're going to have to need a load of international investment, right? That investment's going to come from oligarchs and corporations, basically, and saying, okay, but we are going to strengthen workers' rights, because what you've done is you've gladly put yourself over a barrel for capital by being like, we really need you, we're totally fucked without you. And you've put capital in quite an advantageous position to say, well, actually, we don't want these strengthened workers' rights. That's bad for us. We don't want that. It's also worth remembering how fickle these companies can be, right? At the end of the day, like a lot of them are run by like deeply egotistical individuals who do not like the idea that politicians have an elected mandate to take them on. So when you've got a minister like Louise Hage, who is singing from the government hymn book. I mean, this thing that's really funny, which is the government, and Keir Starmer have now tried to make out that she was a bit of a rogue operator herself, but actually she was singing from the government hymn book. You've got a company saying, well, I don't like it. You haven't treated us with sufficient deference or respect. So we're going to use our leverage, which is putting this massive infrastructure project on hold. And this is the thing about, I do believe that there has to be like some level of private sector investment in order to stimulate the economy. But the degree to which I think Labour is sort of, bent over backwards for them and not really had a plan B, right? They don't have much of a plan B in terms of industrial strategy. That does not fill me with confidence for how strong their workers' rights package is going to be and how much they're going to stick by it when they come under pressure. Because, to go back to the stick metaphor, you've given these companies a really big stick to hit us with. And it's kind of astonishing to me that Labour didn't preempt that in any way, didn't consider it might happen.
Some of these investments. So they include £1.1 billion in cash injection into Stansted Airport by its owner Manchester Airports Group, £279 million from US pharmaceutical giant Eli Lilly to tackle significant health challenges such as obesity, maybe Ozempic, I suppose. £20 billion over the next 5 years from Australian firm Macquarie towards various infrastructure projects, including an electric car charging network. That doesn't sound too bad. But Macquarie has been blamed for saddling Thames Water with unsustainable debts when it was its biggest shareholder. So I suppose the tea leaves aren't amazing when it comes to that. 1 billion confirmed, as we've talked about, by DP World to create 400 new jobs and make London Gateway the UK's largest container port within 5 years. So 400 new jobs. A couple of years ago, they fired 800 people. Now they're hiring back 400. So maybe they're half forgiven. Labour say in total £60 billion has been pledged. Ash, I could ask you about those investments, but instead I prefer to get your thoughts on this.
Welcome to the Guildhall, London's ancient town hall. Isn't it a fantastic building? It's really breathtaking, this Guildhall. Not, of course, to be confused with the nearby Guildhall School of Music, where I once pursued a fleeting ambition to play the flute professionally. I kid you not. Complete with then long hair and very, very flared jeans. All photographic evidence has been destroyed, I'm afraid.
The flute! I kid you not. I was crazy back in the day, the flute. Why would that be? Why would you be kidding? Why would you be making that up? There's nothing wrong with playing the flute. There's just also nothing particularly notable about playing the flute.
The way he admitted it sounded a little bit like, when politicians admit to taking drugs, but they're like, I didn't inhale. I guess with the flute, you really don't inhale. Well, you have to inhale a bit in order to exhale into the flute.
Exhale,
I don't know.
yeah.
I don't play the flute. There's something about Keir Starmer which is very, very Alan Partridge-like. Do you know what I mean? Like, he's very adenoidal. And even these moments where, I almost feel for him because I see what he's trying to do. He's trying to present himself as capable of having a bit of a laugh at his own expense. I was human once too. I've done embarrassing things. Is that he comes across like a middle manager at a corporate away day that no one wants to listen to. There's just something which he can't quite hit about it. And I think it makes me feel sorry for him, actually, because we all have that cringy, just a bit, our timing's a bit off, can't land the joke, we're telling a story no one wants to hear. We all have that in us. I think I identify with him in this moment, is what I'm trying to say.
All I can say, Ash, you're not going to like this. That Laura Kuenssberg clip where she's talking about Boris Johnson? I think he just wants to be liked. And after all, aren't we all a bit like that? I don't know. You're reminding me of someone. Just saying, I'm always the one that gets the beef for being a Starmer apologist in the comments. I'm saying, you better watch out, Ash. Elon Musk's SpaceX has successfully landed part of their Starship rocket back onto its launch pad. SpaceX describes its Starship as the world's most powerful launch vehicle ever developed. It's capable of carrying up to 150 metric tons. And on Sunday morning, the Starship spacecraft, along with its super heavy rocket booster, were launched into the sky. It's what happened next, though, that is seen as revolutionary, because after the booster rocket separated from the Starship spacecraft, it hurtled back to Earth, and then this happened.
Landing burn, 13 ignited. We're now down to 3 Raptor engines. We can see those chopsticks now in view.
Booster having current shutdown.
Megadilla has popped the booster. This is absolutely insane. On the first ever attempt, we have successfully caught the Super Heavy booster back at the launch tower. What an incredible view!
Are you kidding me?
That certainly looked very impressive to me. Unfortunately, there's not much more I can say than that. I'm really not an expert when it comes to these rockets. Thankfully, though, I'm joined by someone who can tell us more. James O'Malley is a freelance tech journalist. Thank you so much for joining me. To begin, why did yesterday's launch matter?
So it's significant for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's the simple reason that Starship is SpaceX's new rocket, and this is the largest rocket ever made. If they can successfully build this rocket and get it to space and everything like that, it will be able to deliver suspected around sort of 200, 300 tons of stuff to orbit, which is a sort of layer, an order of magnitude greater than what every other rocket that currently exists can manage. And that will massively reduce the cost of getting stuff to space. In this particular trial, the reason why it was so important yesterday and so impressive yesterday was basically what we saw. We saw these pair of what they call chopsticks, these grabbing arms on the launch tower, grab the first stage rocket booster out of the air, essentially. And the theory is that once they have perfected the technology, this could be how every rocket launch in the future looks. We'll see rockets take off and we'll see them return to Earth and be grabbed by some arms and basically almost ready to go again once they've been refueled, a bit like a plane. At least it gets us closer to that sort of situation. So as a sort of technological demonstration, it was a sort of a big technological leap forward, and it was a big, I think it was a historic moment.
I suppose in terms of it making it cheaper, I can see how these rocket boosters no longer being single use could be revolutionary, but because before it was the case, with sort of Apollo 11 or whatever, the boosters go up, don't they? And then they fall down to Earth and you never use them again. They're disposable. But SpaceX for a while had been landing its rockets back at Earth. I think it was just sort of platforms at sea, wasn't it? So why does the fact that they can catch it in these chopsticks make a big difference as opposed to landing it on a launch pad in the ocean, if I'm getting that right in the first place?
Yeah, so at the moment, the Falcon 9 is SpaceX's sort of workhorse rocket. This can only deliver sort of 9 tons to orbit in one launch, and they've been landing those since 2015. They've managed to get them, so they're literally launching these rockets once every sort of 3 or 4 days now, and I think they're going to hit 100 launches this year. So that's basically, they figured out how to do it. The reason Starship is going to be a step up from that is because it's a lot bigger, so it's like another order of magnitude in terms of payload and reducing pricing and reducing the price of launch and so on, but also the fact that it's by catching it, the turnaround time is a lot quicker, and I'm sure I'm sure this is going to be something they'll experiment with. There probably will be sort of sea-based landing. At the moment, the Falcon 9 first stages, so only the sort of first half of the Falcon 9 can be landed. They basically decide to land either back at base where they launch or at sea on sort of floating platforms. That basically depends on what orbit the rocket is aiming for and what the payload is and stuff, because it depends how much fuel is left on the rocket basically and whether it can travel backwards. So I'm sure there'll be some variability there, but fundamentally this is just like another step up. It's a bit like going from the sort of the small little plane with the propellers to a Boeing 747 or something like that. It's that sort of difference technologically speaking.
That makes sense. So the ones that were landing in the sea, sort of that I saw on YouTube years ago, they were smaller rockets. This is a bigger rocket, and that's why that sort of makes so much difference. I suppose there might be some people watching thinking, why do I care? For one, it looks like a lot of emissions came from that rocket launcher. Two, do we really care if we can get stuff up to space efficiently? Is this going to benefit many people watching, or is it a vanity project of Elon Musk?
I mean, I definitely think it's a vanity project. He's definitely doing it because it's cool rockets, I think. And don't get me wrong, Musk is a controversial character for many reasons. But I do think this sort of technology, it will ultimately help us, because ultimately, the more we can get into space, the more we can improve the way we live. There's both sort of indirect technological benefits. Since the 1960s, people have talked about how the space race has led to all of these sort of downstream technologies that have benefited us here on Earth. But then also there's almost the direct thing as well, in that what do you do with a satellite? There's almost the direct benefits as well. What do you do with a rocket? Well, you use it to launch satellites, so you can both explore the solar system and learn more about the planets around us, but also you can launch satellites that look back at Earth. So, for example, just with the Falcon 9, so SpaceX's current rocket, that already has sort of reduced the price of launching satellites and so on. Again, you always talk in terms of sort of like the cost per dollar to get a kilogram to orbit. Before the Falcon 9, it was about $10,000. The Falcon 9 reduced that to $2,000. There's speculation and suggestions that Starship could reduce it to, $100 to $10 to $100 is probably one of the more optimistic estimates. But that ultimately means we can have more satellites, and that's stuff like monitoring things like climate change. There are climate change satellites now orbiting the Earth, which launched aboard Falcon 9, that were made by sort of smaller companies or smaller organizations and launched for lower budgets. There are other sort of asset tracking, which sounds unsexy. Nobody cares about like where the containers are on Earth, except that's also quite important if you're trying to get stuff from one place to another. So understanding where stuff is important. And then there's just sort of more observation satellites, better weather satellites. So we'll just have a lot of better data to work with. And then also, there's the other big thing that SpaceX has already started with the Falcon 9 that will become even easier once Starship is up and running, is the Starlink satellite broadband network, which is, at the moment, there are 6,000 satellites, these small satellites all around the Earth. And they basically mean you can now get broadband speed internet almost anywhere. So from the top of a mountain to the middle of the sea. Eventually, I suspect it would be very rare to get on a plane or a train and it not to have this sort of satellite connection. And I think, we can argue about the sort of the politics or the motivations of Elon Musk, or the distribution of who gets to benefit from these technologies first and that sort of thing. But fundamentally, in terms of technological capability, these are sort of new things which will improve how people live here on Earth, I think.
How should we make sense of Elon Musk, I suppose, because many people you don't even have to follow him on Twitter. It just appears in your feed anyway. When people think of Elon Musk now, they think of the guy sharing misinformation on Twitter, right? They think he seems like a complete idiot. At the same time, I mean, he started this company. He does seem to be fairly hands-on in this company, and they are sort of, as you described, making sort of revolutionary advances in space travel technology. How do you make sense of that sort of dichotomy between these two aspects of Elon Musk?
I wish I had a good answer for this, because I would love to know. I mean, the way I've heard it described is that he approaches problems like an engineer, so that you basically try and iterate and you experiment, you blow stuff up until you reach the invention that you need. So, and if you manage to invent an electric car that can go a certain distance, or if you manage to invent a rocket that can do something special, then you've invented it. That's just how you do it. The problem is that he approaches Twitter and the rest of the world like that as well, which is why he's such a sort of chaotic person. I think fundamentally, though, and again, it is very difficult, because ultimately, I think we all want to tell a story, which is, Elon Musk, he's not that significant as an individual, or he's not really the one doing all the work, or it's actually the people under him who are doing all the clever stuff. I think that would be a really convenient story to tell because it would speak to all of our politics. I don't personally like Elon Musk. I find what he's done to Twitter repulsive. His Donald Trump support is horrific and bad for the world and everything else. But I do think there is an unfortunate case that sometimes basically being a bit of an asshole can get results for better or worse. I mean, you look at like Steve Jobs was a notoriously controversial, similarly sort of abrasive character to his employees, and he helped launch the iPhone into the world. Even like Henry Ford, of course, massive anti-Semite, but also invented modern manufacturing and popularized cars, which changed the world. So it's hard. I don't know how you can reconcile these two things. I wish personally he'd stick more to rockets and electric cars than all of his other stuff. But yeah, it's a very difficult one. But I think crucially we can separate the fact that sometimes annoying people who we dislike, who are doing bad things, can also do good things as well, and we somehow have to try and reconcile that because that's just how the world is. People are complicated, I guess.
And it can be the case that some people who are brilliant, I mean, clearly he's a very intelligent person, but he can also be incredibly objectionable and say some stupid stuff when it comes to politics. James O'Malley, thank you for joining me this evening. Thank you so much, Ash, for co-hosting with me tonight.
You know what? That was a much kinder transition than I thought you were going to do. I thought you were going to be like, speaking of annoying people who also can sometimes do good things. But thank you for being so restrained, Michael.
I think your intellect and your empathetic qualities are they've both got rocket boosters. They're incredible. Thank you everyone for watching tonight. Fox is not going to let us go back to Ash for reaction because we're already over an hour. Come back on Monday for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.